G'day folks, this is Raymond Foster. Hope you're doing great. In this video we're going to take a look at and talk about the current anti-white attack on the mythological artistic expression known as the Lord of the Rings, and just generally that universe created around that mythology. Okay, so the world of Middle Earth and all that that incorporates. Fundamentally, if you're unaware, the Lord of the Rings is a traditional and mythological artistic expression, essentially a religious or spiritual mythological story. So it's spiritual myth for white Western folk. The best way to understand something like the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, okay, for what it actually is, the best way to understand this is essentially, if you look at the Aboriginal population, the Aboriginal people, and they have a thing called their Dreamtime stories, alright? So Aboriginals have Dreamtime stories, which is essentially their creation stories, okay? Creation stories, creation myth, religion, their spirituality, their cultural traditions and ways, right? Their Dreamtime stories. So, imagine some company comes in, buys the rights to Dreamtime stories, and then they know they're not going to make any profit. They're not going to make it. You know, it's not going to be successful. It's going to be a flop. Everyone's going to hate it. But there's this company that just goes out of its way to purposely buy the rights to all the Dreamtime stories of the Aboriginal peoples, just to destroy them, change them, mock them, belittle the sacred aspects of them, simply to attack Aboriginal people and their culture. Obviously that's wrong. Lord of the Rings, to somebody like myself, and to any conscious white person, right, that cares about their traditions and their ways, is exactly the same as Dreamtime and the Dreamtime stories and Aboriginal culture and myth to an Aboriginal who cares about their traditions. So in the exact same way, it's racial discrimination to make attacks on this thing in order to dehumanize and degrade the race of the people who are responsible for this thing. Lots of people are failing to defend themselves in argumentation because they're not looking at it correctly. They're not coming at it from a correct point of view. Fundamentally, there's been lots of people obviously upset with the attacks because they see the symptoms of the racial discrimination. They don't see the racial discrimination itself, which is an issue, which hinders their ability to actually stand up against the racial discrimination because they're only addressing the symptoms of it and not the underlying racial discrimination, which is resulting in leading to the consequences, which are those symptoms which they are addressing. For example, changes in the story, like a non-white elf, which is just impossible. That can't happen in existence. All elves are white. They always have been and always will be. Elves are actually a real thing from the real world. It's actually a sacred part of Nordic religion, and an elf is an old ancestor. It's one of our ancestors. So if part of our family, a grandma, a grandfather, your great-grandma, they're elves. If you're white, your great-grandma is an elf. If you believe in the Nordic traditions, our sacred faith and religions as white people, okay, your past grandma is called an elf in that religious tradition. So in Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien, because he wanted to create a mythology, a religious mythology for the white race, he obviously included that term, that people, elves, and they're immortal. They're they're kind of human, but they're a bit different. Why? Because that's your past grandma, that's your dead grandfather, that's your great grandma, your great great grandma, that's your past mother and father. If you lost your parents, It's your children who have passed, if you happen to have lost your children. They're the elves. who go away to live immortally with the god in the Lord of the Rings Middle-earth universe, because that's our sacred tradition, that's mythology, that's a part of our sacred ancient religion and ways as the white race, as Western kind. Again, exactly the same as Dreamtime for Aboriginal people. So if you go in and you change a Dreamtime story simply to racially attack Aboriginal people, that's wrong. And I hope everyone can agree that that's wrong, that's racial discrimination, that's bigoted. So in the same way, if you go into something like Lord of the Rings, it's exactly the same as Dreamtime story for Aboriginal people, but it's for Dreamtime for white people, my race. And you go in and you try to change an elf to a non-white. One of my ancestors, so my great-grandma was white. My great-great-grandma was definitely white. All of my ancestors, my past ancestors from my white race are all white. So all elves have to be white. Because that's my grandma, bro. Literally, my grandma is an elf because she's a white ancestor of mine who has passed. So now in our religious traditions, she is literally an elf. And she watches over me. Like all my ancestors. Alright? So it's no different from going in and changing the Dreamtime story, twisting it up, simply to attack and degrade and dehumanize Aboriginal people. It's disgusting and wrong. The issue is, again, people aren't addressing the underlying racial discrimination. They're just pointing out, oh look, there's a non-white elf. There shouldn't be a non-white elf. But they're not explaining why. They're not using the right terminology to really address why there cannot be. Not that there shouldn't, there can't be. There never can be and there never will be a non-white elf. Because literally an elf is a past ancestor of a white person who's died. So an elf can only be white. Obviously. So in the same way, the echidna in the Dreamtime story can only be an echidna. You can't just change the echidna from the Dreamtime story. That's racial discrimination and an attack on the Aboriginal people. The same way you try to change an elf to a non-white in Lord of the Rings, that's an attack on the white race, racial discrimination, because that's religious, it's sacred to our people. But they're not addressing it in this manner, so what's happening? They're being called racist, they're being slandered with anti-white slurs, more racial discrimination, because they're trying to stand up against the racial discrimination against their own people and our race. So, if you want to be successful, you want to be, pragmatic in addressing this racial discrimination, this attack on Lord of the Rings, which is an attack on the white race and our sacred traditions, right? You have to do it in a way in which you address it as anti-white racial discrimination. Because if you don't address it as anti-white racial discrimination and you just say, oh look, there shouldn't be a non-white elf, alright? Then the anti-whites who are trying to racially discriminate against us and abuse our innocent children, etc., traumatize them, dehumanize them, the psychological trauma, then they will lash back and they'll have justifications, they'll have excuses, and they'll come up with things and, again, pretexts, excuses to try to justify this attack on something sacred to our people, like Lord of the Rings. And they'll say, oh no, you're just a racist, why don't you want to see a non-white elf? Have you got a problem with a black elf? Oh, there's something wrong with you. Whereas if you just address it as it is, you say, no, Lord of the Rings for white people is the same as Dreamtime for Aboriginals. So if I go in just to attack Aboriginal people and try to change the echidna in a Dreamtime story to something else, that's wrong. So in the same way, you come in Lord of the Rings, you try to change an elf to anything but white, the same, it's racial discrimination, wrong. And if you address it in that way, nobody can try to lash out and say, what's your problem? Why don't you want there to be a black elf? Because obviously I haven't got a problem. It's just a fact there can't be a black elf. Because as I explained before, elves are a Western tradition, so my past grandma is an elf because it's our dead ancestors. And I know all my ancestors are white, so all elves are white. Because they're my ancestors. It's just a fact. So an attack on that is an attack on me, my race, my traditions, my family, my people. And that's the way you address it. So nobody can try to say you're the baddie because you just don't want a black elf. or something, right? We address it for what it is. It's racial discrimination against our people, our traditions, our ways. And I know a lot of people struggle in this day and age to see racial discrimination against white people. But if you just compare it to another group like that, make it simple, everyone will see it for what it is. It's the same as attacking Dreamtime stories of the Aboriginal people, and everyone understands and can see that that's wrong. You don't have to think twice about it. But when it's a white tradition, white people, racial discrimination against the white race and my people, you do have to think twice about it, because we're the most persecuted race at the moment, and discrimination against us is that bad, people even try to deny that it exists. That's enough for today's video, folks. Catch you next time. If you got any questions, leave them below. Like the video and all that nonsense. Take it easy.